Proverbs. We're doing a short series on the book of Proverbs. Did everyone who wanted a handout get one? We do have a couple extra ones. Did everyone get one? Okay. Today we'll get into the book of Proverbs. We're going to look at the first 7 verses. And don't worry, we're not going 7 verses at a time through the book of Proverbs. But the first 7 are perhaps the most important. So we will cover these today. And we could really spend weeks on the first 7 verses, to be honest with you. So Proverbs chapter 1, and I'm just going to read the first 7 verses, and then we'll take a look at these. Proverbs 1, verses 1 through 7, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So we'll take a look at these verses. I called it here the prologue, verses 1 through 7, but sometimes you'll see it called the preamble, I think is another word that I've commonly seen. It's like the introduction to the introduction. Chapters 1 through 9, as you recall, are the introduction to the book of Proverbs. And verses 1 through 7 are kind of the introduction to the introduction. Okay, so last week we looked at the introduction to the book of Proverbs. Today we'll look at verses 1 through 7. Next week we'll have a special speaker, so we will not have our Sunday school lesson in Proverbs next Sunday. As it looks like, I've got to fix that. As it looks like today, I won't be filling in Morris in the month of February because they wanted me to be there next Sunday, but the pastor asked me to preach next Sunday because he'll be gone during the week. He'll be here next Sunday, but he just asked me to preach. So you'll still, I guess I'll still be here. Then, because Proverbs 1 through 9 is the introductory to the whole book, we'll spend 2 weeks on those chapters. And then 3 topics we'll look at. What does Proverbs say about money? What does it say about wine and strong drink? What does it say about politics or our role in politics? I thought that is actually kind of fitting this year. It's another presidential election. It seems like we just had one. Now we've got another one. And then a kind of an overview of the book of Proverbs at the end, theology of the book of Proverbs. Okay, so by way of review, we talked about wisdom teaching, because the book of Proverbs is wisdom teaching. What is that? So wisdom teaching assumes an all-pervading plan and order for the universe. Now, God created the universe with that order and that plan. Okay, so it's passive here, but God's the one who did it. Which man must follow and live according to in order to live with skill. And I did fix that little wording from last week. But the idea is God's created the world with order and with a plan, and if we live in accordance with that plan, in accordance to that order, we will be wise. But it takes skill, just like any kind of skill that you would learn how to do, it takes skill to learn how to do that. And so this is what wisdom teaching is all about. How do we navigate, so to speak, the world around us? So a short definition is wisdom is skill in living, and that'll come up again today as we look at the first 7 verses. All right, so here's our outline. We're going to look at the introduction today. This is the outline of the whole book. So again, the collections of Solomon, the words of the wise, and then we have Agur and Lemuel at the end, and Lemuel's poem about his wife, or future wife. All right, so here are the first 7 verses. A little bit of a small outline. If you have your handout, the handout basically follows the outline. It doesn't just give the outline, but it's going to walk you through each little section of the outline. So the first verse is the title, and the title is simply the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. So the title basically says that Solomon was the author. Now we know that Solomon didn't write the whole book, because especially those last 2 chapters were written by somebody else. But he either wrote or influenced the rest of it. So, so the title is still fitting. We're told that it's the son of David and the king of Israel. And you remember, we didn't look at this last week, but 1 Corinthians 3 is where God comes to Solomon and asks him, what gift do you want as the next king, the king after David? David dies in 1 Kings 2. And Solomon says, I'm a young man, I need wisdom. And so God says, well, because you didn't ask for riches, you didn't ask for gold, you didn't ask for strength in soldiers or army or military, because you asked for wisdom, I'll give you a double portion of wisdom. I will make you the wisest man in the world. And so by giving us this title here, the Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, it's bringing us back to that passage. It assumes we know that story from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, or 1 Kings, sorry, chapter 3, wrong testament. So that's the title. Verses 2 through 6 are the purposes of the book, and then the verse 7 is the theme. We'll spend more time on the purposes here as we kind of walk through the outline. So there are 2 purposes given to us in verse 2. The first one is to know wisdom and instruction, and then the second is to understand words of insight. Now, the first part is to know wisdom and instruction, and this phrase here is sometimes called moral excellence. This is often what we think about with the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is how to live a godly life in the world. What is morally excellent? What is upright? What is the godly way of living? It's not book smarts. It's not, being able to do calculus. That's not the goal of the book of Proverbs. The emphasis is on living a righteous life, living with godly wisdom in the world. So the first is moral excellence in the first part of chapter 2. Or verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction. This is moral excellence. Now the word to know is kind of it's an interesting word. We have basically the word know, K-N-O-W, the word to know in English. We have one word. Now sometimes we might use the word understand. We might use the word comprehend. Those are, we might use some different words that are similar, but the idea of to know in Hebrew often has the connotation, actually, of being very acquainted with something, intimately acquainted. So all those verses back in Genesis where it says things like Adam knew his wife Eve, that's the same word that we have here. Also, in Proverbs 1 through 9, we have the contrast between Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, and we'll see that over the next couple weeks when we look through chapters 1 through 9. And there we are instructed that the young man is to know Lady Wisdom. He's supposed to be intimately acquainted with her. He should know nothing at all about Lady Folly. He should stay away from her. A 10-foot pole length between him and Lady Folly. But his goal is to know wisdom. So that's why there's a sense in which there's a desire. I mentioned last week, I think it was, Yeah, I mentioned it last week. The purpose of the book of Proverbs is to create in us an unquenchable desire for wisdom. And so that's what this idea of to know is. We want to be very acquainted with this. We want to pursue this. And then the words wisdom and instruction, the word for wisdom in Hebrew is chokmah, and the word for wisdom in Greek is Sophia. Now, if you know, my oldest daughter's name is Sophia, and I would joke that I just wanted, I wanted my daughter to grow up to be wise, so I named her Sophia. But then all my friends who knew Hebrew would say, well, why didn't you name her Chokmah? And I said, well, I think that's self-explanatory. All right, so the idea of wisdom in the Old Testament is actually a skill. And there are passages we won't look at today, but many in Exodus around the building of the tabernacle. God gave certain men a skill in working with metal, brass, iron, all those things. He would give a certain group of people skill in working with fabrics and weaving and those types of things so that they could build the tabernacle. Some of you are skilled in woodworking and can build things like this. I don't know who could do that. I don't know who did that. Did somebody do that? Oh, John did that. Or if you talk to John's brother about skill in cabinet building. These are people who they're highly skilled in that type of thing. It's a technical skill or an aptitude for something. And so throughout the Old Testament, this idea of having skill in something is being wise in something. There was, and I still can't remember his name. He used to run he used to run Lemar in Granite Falls. Who?
Tim Crowley.
Yes, Tim Crowley, thank you. I met him once, and I don't know if you met him or not, but people said about Tim Crowley that there was not a horse he couldn't handle. Like, he just knew horses. He knew them almost like from the inside out, we might say. And he had high skill. In the Old Testament then, in the Jewish way of thinking, they would say that he had wisdom as it pertained to horses. And so this wisdom that we're looking at here, that we're being encouraged to know, is to know the skill of living a godly life in this world. And then the word instruction is actually more closely aligned to discipleship. It's putting yourself under the authority of somebody else so that you can learn from them. And this is, like an apprenticeship. If I want to learn how to work with wood, I might go to John's shop and do what he tells me. And if I don't do what he tells me, he might hit me in the side of the head with a board to teach me a lesson. But that's how I learn. I humble myself and put myself under his authority. And I cross-reference 2 Timothy 3:16 in your handout, and this is why. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching. Now, what does that teaching look like? How does somebody get teaching? Well, they get reproof, they get correction, and they get training in righteousness. And that actually really encapsulates this word instruction in Proverbs. So when you see that in Proverbs, that idea of instruction, it's that idea of being discipled, ultimately by the Word of God, but we see the discipleship happening between people in the book. The wise man and the fool, or different kinds of fools. The wise man and the young man, most often, is the example that we're given. Now, this moral excellence is worked out. We're given more information about this in verses 3 through 5. So what is this? To know wisdom instruction, what do we gain? We receive instruction in wise dealing. So there's the word instruction again. We receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. So there's a lot of words here that we won't go through right now. But the ideas of justice in verse 3, righteousness, justice, and equity, I wanted to mention briefly. In the ESV, the translation of righteousness is actually a good translation. I think the Old King James has justice. I think I have the King James up there. Justice, judgment, and equity. But righteousness is probably a better translation. And obviously, to be righteous is well, it's to be right in your dealings with people, honest in your dealings with people. Justice is the second one. Judgment is probably better translated as justice, and the idea of justice here is fitting. What is fitting in that sense for the situation? So we often think about this by way of punishment. What is a just punishment given the situation that we have at hand, given the events that occurred, and someone needs to be punished? What is just punishment for that? Likewise, what's a just reward? Something were to do something good that deserved an award. What would be the right or fitting reward for that? So you can see that the discernment is in all of these. What's right versus what's wrong. What's appropriate, either punishment or reward given the circumstances. And then equity is the idea really about fairness. Might be a good translation for equity. It has the idea, I'm trying to think, of almost being being true to duty or faithful to one's word is one way of looking at it in the Old Testament. It's kind of like a ruler or a yardstick, that kind of ruler, that makes sure that something is proper in its length. But it's the idea of being, of fairly treating everyone that's the situation at hand. The word equity has been changed in its definition in modern usage to something that doesn't mean fairness, but in the sense of Proverbs, it's the idea of fairness. Okay, so the first one, moral excellence. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So yeah, moral excellence, that's what we're looking at. Is our uprightness of our life, and he gives some explanation there, which we could spend a lot of time on, but we'll go on. It's specifically applied to the simple. The simple person, just to kind of fill that in. A simple person is a person who isn't rebellious. They don't know what's right and then they refuse to do it. The simple is more like someone who hasn't made up their mind. They kind of go with the flow. They're not the leader of the blind, but they're one of the followers of the blind. You know, they're not actively making a decision one way or the other. And so you probably know some people who are kind of like that. They just kind of float through life. They don't necessarily act based on their conviction, positively or negatively. To the youth is obvious. That's young people who, especially young men who are immature. Most young men are. And I can say that. I was one. And then to the wise and to the man of understanding. So again, I mentioned this before, the wise and the man of understanding can gain wisdom. So we never fully attain all of wisdom. We're always learning to make discernment and make judgment. So that's the first one, moral excellence. And then the second one is mental enlightenment. Now, as I said, this isn't, if you read the book of Proverbs, you won't go home and do calculus. Now, you might, but not because you read the book of Proverbs. What it's talking about there, to understand words of insight, that phrase in the second part of verse 2, to understand words of insight is actually very difficult to translate. It's very, very difficult to translate. But the idea, and partly because the same word is used more than once in the sentence. But you take that with verse 6, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. And what Solomon is saying is, if you study the book of Proverbs, one thing you should learn how to do over time is to interpret Proverbs, the individual Proverbs, not the book of Proverbs. You should learn what they mean, and you should be able to learn how to apply them to your life, or given a situation in life. That's what he's talking about by the mental enlightenment, is being able to have understanding, interpretation of the Proverbs themselves. Now, that doesn't come all at once. There are Proverbs where it might, the first time we read them, we don't understand what he's talking about. But a few years later, we might come to that and say, oh, now I have better understanding, and now this makes sense to me, and now I know how to apply this to my given situation. So there's always, in that sense, more to learn. So the idea of mental enlightenment is our ability to increase in understanding of hard sayings or difficult things, or like maybe what I'm, say when I'm standing up here and you don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know. All right, so, and the words of insight, maybe just to state that again, insight is, again, the ability to discern between two things. So you remember Solomon, when Solomon's first test of his wisdom, two mothers come in with a baby. Who's the real mother? Solomon's trying to discern. He's trying to figure out which woman is the mother. He's trying to figure out which of those two options is the correct one. So he's trying to figure that out. Is it this one or is it that one? And that's what discernment is really about. It's distinguishing between two things. Is this the proper way to go here, or is this the proper way to go here? And that's what we're trying to, in all areas of life, that's what we're trying to learn how to do, to have skill in doing that. So verse 2, oh, there we go. Starts the idea of moral excellence and then finishes with the mental enlightenment, and then 3 through 5 finishes moral excellence, and I don't know where I'm going here, and mental enlightenment. Okay, so any questions on that so far? I could go into more detail on any of these, but we have, I'm stuck between you and the meal. I'm trying to discern the situation and how to act wisely given it. All right, so the fear of the Lord, and then maybe we can just spend a few more minutes on the fear of the Lord, because we could spend a whole Sunday school hour on the fear of the Lord. Sometimes you'll see when there's a phrase or something like that, you say, well, how do you understand what the phrase means? And sometimes someone will say, well, take it apart. What is a briefcase? Well, it's a case that carries briefs, briefs being legal briefs. And so you get briefcase. And then you say, okay, what is a butterfly? Well, that doesn't work. So, so we can't always do that with a compound word. But the fear of the Lord, just that to say, when we look at the Old Testament, we look at the fear of the Lord, we have to take that as kind of a phrase, a unit. Instead of looking at fear and Lord and then trying to put them back together again. But the fear of the Lord is found throughout the Old Testament. It is sometimes called the beginning of wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We often have that phrase memorized. And Proverbs 1:7 usually trips us up, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's Proverbs 9:10. So Proverbs 1 through 9 is the introduction to the book of Proverbs. It's going to teach us how to interpret Proverbs. And it begins with verse 7, the fear of the Lord, and chapter 9, verse 10, not quite at the very end, but close to the end of chapter 9, it ends with the fear of the Lord. So those two kind of are like bookends to the book of Proverbs that show us that it's really the key to understanding any wisdom, having any wisdom in this world. The fear of the Lord is also called instruction of wisdom in Proverbs 13. In Proverbs chapter 8, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. So turning away, not just a positive thing, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge or wisdom, but it's also a negative thing. It's hating evil or turning away from evil. In chapter 16, it's depart from evil. And Job 28 says that wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And I'll just read that verse for us. Job 28:28, Job says, this is a long soliloquy about wisdom, but Job says at the end of that long discourse on wisdom, he says, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. So they're equated to each other. But then also notice it says, and to turn away from evil is understanding. So again, there's another turning away from evil being part of the fear of the Lord. So there's a few verses that include that. Now, the word fear in the Old Testament by itself is often used to denote reverence or piety. And the Lord, there is the covenant name for the Lord. So there's two names you probably know. Well, there's many. Words for the Lord in the Old Testament. The ESV, the word Lord is all capitals, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which I don't have here on the slide. That tells you it's the name Yahweh or Jehovah. That's the name from Exodus 3. You can look at the story of that name. But that's the name that God gives to Moses. When Moses says, I'm going to go to or God says to Moses, go to the people of Israel and lead them out. Moses says, who should I tell them I'm representing? And God says, Jehovah or Yahweh, I am the one who's sending you. Tell them that. That's my name. So this is the name that's associated with the covenant that's made with Israel. So some definitions that have been given for the fear of the Lord, or descriptions of the fear of the Lord. One is a reverential awe of God. So we come before his presence with fear and trembling. We're told to worship God with fear and trembling. So that's a reverential awe of God. It is also a dependence on God, and it's used that way actually in Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 7. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make make straight your paths. I had two translations going different directions there. But verse 7 says, be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. So it's associated with a dependence on God. It's also associated with the hatred of evil, which I've already cited 3 passages that tell us that. And the idea again here is if God is created, so given that God has created the world with order and with a plan, and wisdom is living in accordance with it, figuring it out and living according to it. That's wisdom. Then by nature, the other side of the coin has to be that we hate evil, because evil would be trying to do the opposite, live opposite to God's order in the universe, trying to thwart God's plan in the world. That would be evil. And so the fear of the Lord, on one hand, keeps us on the path, but by keeping us on the path, it also puts in our mouths a distaste for leaving the path. We begin to cherish the path that God has put in front of us, and we begin to hate the other paths, or the veering off of that. The fear of the Lord is also associated with love for the Lord, and not in any. The fear that we're talking about here is not a slavish dread. Now, Hebrews 10, verse 31, tells Christians that it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God. But it's talking about a judgment of sin. If we continue in sin against God, knowingly, high-handedly, Numbers 15, there is a judgment that awaits even a believer. And that's a fearful thing. Now that's that kind of fear. But the fear of the Lord here is not that kind of fear, but the fear of, in a sense, of loving what God loves and hating what God hates. Now this fear of the Lord, which I think I put a quotation in your handout. Did I? Oh, wait. I think that I took from somebody else, because I put it in quotation marks. Yeah. One definition, it's in the last paragraph, one definition of the fear of the Lord is the affectionate reverence. So the word affectionate is a loving, affectionate reverence, by which the child of God bends himself humbly, typo, how many times did I read this? And carefully to his Father's law. The typo's mine. Humbly and carefully to his